The rain fell in gentle whispers against the adamantium roof of Research Outpost. Secundus a rhythm that seemed to synchronize itself with the ticking of an ancient chronometer on AEPT historian Thaddeus Vogel's desk. 63. Terran years he had spent in service to the Lexicanum Imperialis, and for the last 17 of those years, this small outpost on the front world of New Ithaca had been his home, his sanctuary of knowledge floating in the ignorance that plagued the wider Imperium. Vogel had allowed the calming noise of the rain to pull him into his thoughts, and his thin fingers traced a worn gold band in his right hand, a gift from Margos Demetrius during his apprenticeship. A lifetime ago, "Truth is salvation," read the high Gothic inscription, a dangerous sentiment in an empire where truth was so often sacrificed. Upon the altar of necessity, truth is indeed salvation, he thought to himself, as he adjusted the small brass luminator that cast a warm amber glow across his desk. The light caught motes of dust that danced through the air, mingling with the smells of aged old books, preservative oils, and the faint scent of the electrowards that protected his most valuable texts from the ever-present threat of vermin and decay beyond the armoured glass of the viewport. The untamed landscape of New Ithaca spread outward craggy mountains, thrusting upward like the knuckles of a massive buried hand. Short tough grass of emerald green clung stubbornly to the rocky soil, bending beneath the weight of the evening rain. In the far distance, the lights of Hab settlement Tertius glimmered faintly. A small island of humanity in the vast wilderness. Hull could not help but see it as a metaphor for the Imperium itself, a flickering light in an uncaring cosmos. The old historian sipped from his earthen war cup, savouring the bitter warmth of the recaf, a small luxury in this remote posting. One of the few he permitted himself, the stimulant would keep his mind sharp for several more hours long enough to complete today's portion of his most recent work. A comprehensive chronicle of Malcador Sigillite scattered across his desk lay the fruits of decades of research, data slates containing fragments of administrative records from the Great Crusade, picked captures of architectural sites on Terra that had once housed the earliest administratum offices, transcripts of inquisitorial interviews with individuals who claimed ancestral memories of the unification. War's most precious of all was a thin volume bound in what appeared to be human skin, the partial journal of an iterator who had allegedly conversed with Mador during the final days before the siege of Terra. The Vox unit in the corner crackled occasionally with atmospheric interference, breaking the silence with bursts of white noise each time Vogo glanced up, momentarily reminded that even here, hundreds of light years from the heart of the Imperium, he was not truly alone. Once per month, a transport ship would arrive bearing supplies, new research materials, and most crucially cryptic instructions from his handlers within the Ordo Malas. They'd commissioned this work years ago. Dozens of historians had contributed to it before him, and dozens more would likely continue after his bones had turned to dust. The complete chronicle would never be published, never be read by ordinary imperial citizens. It was knowledge for knowledge's sake, or perhaps as Vogel sometimes permitted himself to imagine, for some future crisis when understanding the true nature of the Emperor's most trusted servant might prove crucial to humanity's survival. A draught of cold air slipped through the imperfect seal of the Hab block, causing the parchment to flutter slightly. Vogel weighted it with a small chunk of polished obsidian, a fragment from the ruins of what might once have been Apre heresy. Shrine. The chill raised gooseflesh on his thin arms, reminding him of his own mortality, dipping his quill into the inkwell of deep midnight blue, a pigment derived from the native flora of New Ithaca and Costinga. Small fortune to produce. Vogel began the day's writing. The scratching of nib against parchment joined the patter of rain and the ticking chronometer in a comforting harmony of purpose. What manner of man was Malcador the Sigillite? He wrote, the elegant script flowing from decades of practice. This question has vexed imperial scholars since the earliest days following the Horus heresy. He was not born a demigod like the primer, nor was he transformed by technological means. Like the Adepta Artis, Yet in the long records of imperial history, his impact rivals that of any transhuman. Vogel paused, glancing at the small tarnished silver aquila that hung above his workspace. The twin-headed eagle symbol of the Imperium for 10 millennia watched over his labors with blind metal eyes. Was there approval in that sightless gaze or judgment? The historian could never decide. From the small heating unit in the corner came the soft hum of ancient technology still functioning after all these years. The familiar sounds and scents grounded him, connecting this moment to all the days and nights that had come before, the countless hours spent piecing together the fragments of a life. 10,000 years passed. The thought of Malcador, that figure who had stood in the shadow of the Emperor himself, had the Sigillite ever paused in his labors, ever questioned the weight of responsibility upon his shoulders? Vogel doubted it, in that, if nothing else, the old historian aspired to emulate his subject. Outside, the rain intensified, drumming against the roof with greater urgency. The wind picked up, whistling around the corners of the outpost, but within all was calm, orderly, purposeful. Vogel wrote on, lost in contemplation of another time, another storm, when the fate of all mankind had rested upon the shoulders of a seemingly ordinary man who had proven himself, in the end, to be anything but ordinary. This, then, is the chronicle of Malcador, the Sigillite, regent, Lord Kingmaker, final guardian of ancient terror, an architect of the Imperium that endures to this day. This is the accounting of the hero from the historical chronicles of the Imperial Palace, compiled by Adept Historicus Quintus van Imperial. Archives 561, M41. The events of the 31st millennium that ended in the interment of the God Emperor upon the Golden Throne are well documented in imperial histories, though many details remain obscured by time and deliberate reduction by order of the Ordo Malus, less known to the masses but still of great importance in understanding the survival of the Imperium itself, is the sacrifice of Malcador the Sigillite in the final hours of the Horus heresy. Historical records preserved within the sealed vaults of the Imperial Palace confirm that during the Siege of Terror, when the arch-traitor Horus teleported to his battle barge, Vengeful Spirit, with the intent of confronting the Emperor directly, it was Malcador the Sigillite who assumed the Emperor's place upon the Golden Throne. The significance of this act cannot be overstated without Maldor's willingness to endure this burden. The Emperor could not have left the throne to confront his treacherous son, and the fate of humanity might have been irrevocably altered. The Golden Throne, misunderstood by many as a simple life support system for the Emperor, was originally created as a control mechanism for the Emperor's secret project beneath the Imperial Palace, the creation of a human extension into the webway following Magnus, the red psychic message warning of Horus's betrayal, which breached the protective shields around the webway project. The throne became essential in holding back the tides of the warp that threatened to engulf Terra itself. Fragmentary records from the fortress monastery of the Grey Knights on Titan indicate that Malcador, despite his advanced age and purely human physiology, maintained this psychic barrier for a period estimated between 72 and 76 standard hours. Multiple independent sources confirmed that maintaining the throne functions requires enormous psychic output, a burden that would instantly destroy most human psychos. That Malcador endured for so long speaks to an extraordinary psychic prowess widely regarded as second only to the Emperor himself. When the Emperor's return to the palace, grievously wounded from his confrontation with Horus, Malcador was removed from the throne. Here he was described as withered beyond recognition, and many records write that his body crumbled to ash after transferring his remaining life force to the Emperor. This final act of sacrifice provided the Emperor with enough strength to issue his last commands and set in motion the restructuring of the Imperium that would preserve humanity through the subsequent millennia. It was in recognition of this ultimate sacrifice that the Emperor decreed Malcador would thereafter be known as Malcador the Hero, a title that, while used in official imperial histories, has sadly become less prominent in popular texts that focus primarily on the Emperor's own sacrifice to understand the impact of Mordor's final act. We must understand who this remarkable individual was. Historical evidence indicates that Malcador had served as the Emperor's most trusted advisor since the Unification Wars on Terra. His official title of Sigillite, meaning seal-bearer in an ancient Terran language, was a hint at his authority. Before taking the name Malcador, he was known as Malcador, identified in preserved records as the last surviving member of the Sigillite, an ancient organization dedicated to preserving human knowledge through the turmoil of old night. The Sigillite fortress in the Himalayan mountains later became incorporated into the foundations of the imperial palace itself. Some even say this is a swim of how Mordor's wisdom formed the bedrock of imperial governance. As First Lord of Terra and Imperial Regent during the Great Crusade, Malcador established the administrative frameworks that enabled the expansion of the new Imperium, the Council of Terra, the early imperial tithe system, and the civilian bureaucracy that would evolve into the Adeptus Administratum. Were all Malcador creations less publicly acknowledged, but confirmed in sealed inquisitorial archives, is his founding of the Officio Assassinorum and his instrumental role in establishing both the Inquisition and the Grey Knights chapter evidence recovered from the Sigillite's personal chambers indicates. He was approximately 700 standard years old at the time of his death, making him one of the oldest known perpetuals in human history. This extraordinary longevity gave him a perspective on human civilization that spanned the heights of the dark age of technology through the depths of old night while not possessing the Emperor's full vision. Mordor's understanding of humanity's cyclical rise and fall gave him much-needed context for shaping humanity. His preference for working from the shadows means that many of his most significant contributions went largely unrecorded. Primary sources include the personal journals of Rogaldorn, heavily redacted but preserved in imperial fists, archives, fragments of testimony from the Knights Errand, and certain sealed accounts within Mechanicum data vaults on Mars of particular value are the Chamber's Malcador documents discovered in 2003. M39 during renovation of the deepest levels of the Imperial Palace. These partial records written in Mordor's own hand provide glimpses into his strategic thinking during the Unification period, an early Great Crusade, although sections pertaining to the Emperor's origins and certain contingency measures have been deemed heretical and remain sealed by inquisitorial decree. Less reliable are the collected oral traditions of certain noble houses dating back to the Unification Wars, which contain accounts of Mordor's diplomatic interventions. These must be approached with caution, as they often contain exaggerations designed to elevate the status of the house in question, yet cross. Referencing across multiple traditions reveals consistent patterns that align with confirmed historical events. The most questionable sources are the popular legends about the Ancient One that persist among the hive workers of Terra. While these tales contain kernels of truth about Malcador's psychic feats, they have become intermingled with devotional stories about the Emperor and various imperial saints, making it difficult to separate fact from religious embellishment. What emerges from these varied sources is a portrait of an individual whose influence on the Imperium was profound. Yet, very obscured, he operated in the Emperor's shadow by choice-building institutions rather than monuments to himself, securing humanity's future through systems and structures rather than personal glory. His final sacrifice on the Golden Throne, to me, shows us the expression of a life dedicated to service, without recognition in the words attributed to Constantine Valdor, first Captain General of the Adeptus Custodes, the Emperor's Light. Shone before all, but it was Maldor's hand that often directed its beam. This work aims to illuminate that guiding hand and provide a more complete understanding of the foundations upon which the Imperium of Man was built. In studying Malcador, the hero, we study not just a single remarkable individual, but the very principles of duty, sacrifice, and foresight that have sustained the Emperor's vision for 10,000 years. I'm of the opinion that to fully comprehend the significance of Malcador, and indeed the sigil sites as a whole, one must first understand the apocalyptic conditions from which they emerged. The age of strife, known in some ancient texts as Old KN, represent the most catastrophic regression in human history, beginning approximately in the 25th millennium, and continuing until the Emperor's unification wars in the 30th. This era saw the complete collapse of humanity's interstellar civilization. The onset of this dark age was marked by two consecutive calamities. The first was the emergence of widespread human psychic mutation and the eruption of massive warp storms throughout the galaxy. These storms, now understood to have been caused by the chaos entity known as Slanesh within the warp, rendered interstellar travel and communication impossible for millennia. Isolated from one another, human colonies that had once formed a vast federation fell into technological standstill, superstition, and warfare. Terra, the cradle of humanity, suffered perhaps the most dramatic fall. Archaeological evidence from pre-unification shows us that Terra had once been a world of remarkable technological achievement and environmental balance. By the late Age of Strife, it had devolved into a patchwork of warring tech and barbarian states, fighting over dwindling resources on a planet whose biosphere had been devastated by nuclear, chemical, and biological warfare. Continents spanning hive cities, many of which would later form the foundation of imperial rule, had become isolated. Fortress states, the oceans had been reduced to vast toxic chemical sinks. The atmosphere required filtration to breathe in many regions, and Terra's population, once carefully managed, had exploded beyond sustainable levels, leading to resource wars that further devastated the planet. It was in this environment of constant warfare and cultural collapse that the importance of the Sigillite becomes apparent. From what we understand, the order of the Sigillite predated the Age of Strife by several centuries, at minimum founded during the latter days of the Dark Age of technology. The organization appears to have been established by a collection of historians, archivists, and cultural preservationists who predicted the coming collapse of human civilization. The name Sigillite derives from the ancient Terran word sigillum, meaning seal or signet. This reflected their self-appointed role as the authenticators and preservers of human knowledge and achievement. Unlike many preservation efforts of that era, the Sigillites concern themselves with the totality of human culture, art, literature, philosophy, history, and music. Alongside scientific knowledge, the Sigillite Charter, fragments of which survived in Maldor's personal effects, established three core principles for the order to preserve the highest achievements of human civilization against any calamity, to maintain the continuity of human cultural memory across dark ages, and to reintroduce preserved knowledge when conditions allowed civilization to flourish again. There is evidence to suggest that the Sigillite established repositories on multiple worlds, though as the Age of Strife progressed, all contact between these various branches was lost. The Terran branch, based in the natural forces forests of the Himalayan mountains, would become the only definitively confirmed survival of the order. Linguistic analysis of the name Bra-Alador suggests origins in the regions once known as the Middle East or Central Asia, though the name may have been adopted rather than given at birth. The literal translation approximates to Abraham, the greener, Abraham, the verdant, in ancient Terran languages, potentially a reference to his role as a keeper of growing knowledge. According to the Chambers, Malcador documents, Alador joined the Order of the Sigillite approximately 400 years before the worst warp storms isolated Terra. Having already lived for several millennia, his unusually long life and accumulated wisdom made him invaluable to the Order, and he rose quickly through its ranks. By the time Terra was fully cut off from its colonies, Alador had become the master of the Terran Reposit. What distinguished him was his apparent psychic potential, while less powerful than the Emperor historical assessments, place him as arguably the second most powerful human psyker in recorded history, with abilities that far surpassed even exceptional psykers like Magnus, theired in certain respects, particularly in terms of control and precision. This combination of long life and psychic power made him uniquely suited to preserve knowledge through the coming millennia of darkness. Unlike normal humans, he could personally ensure continuity across generations, maintaining the original intent and context of preserved information, rather than allowing it to degrade through reinterpretation. The primary repository of the Sigillite in the Himalayan mountains was chosen for multiple strategic advantages: natural defensibility, geological stability, isolation from population centers, and the preservation effects of the cold, dry mountain air. Archaeological excavations done during the Great Crusade era, then sealed thereafter by imperial decree, show us that the original structure appears to have been constructed during the Dark Age of technology, utilizing advanced materials and construction techniques lost during Old Night. The fortress was expanded numerous times throughout its history, eventually covering approximately 20 square kilometers of the mountain range, with significant portions extending deep into the mountains themselves. The fortress was divided into specialized repositories, each dedicated to preserving different aspects of human achievement. The Biblia Historica was the largest section containing historical texts, cultural records, and literary works from across human space. The Gorum was a repository of genetic material from Terran plants and animal species, many of which went extinct during the Age of Strife. There was the Mechanicum Vault, where technical schematics, scientific data, and technological artifacts were stored. The Galleria Memoriae housed art, music, and cultural artifacts deemed of particular significance to human identity and achievement, and the Sanctum Cognitus, home to philosophical works, religious texts, and records of humanity's VAR/IOU's belief systems throughout history. Most remarkable was the preservation methodology rather than relying solely on a single medium. The Sigillite employed redundant preservation across multiple formats: books, data crystals, holic recordings, mnemonic engrams, and even psychically imprinted materials that could only be read by those with psychic ability. This ensured that even if some technologies became inoperable, the knowledge itself would survive. As the Age of Strife progressed, the Order of the Sigillite faced mounting challenges to its existence. The technological regression of Terra meant that power systems, environmental controls, and preservation technologies within the fortress became increasingly difficult to maintain. The constant warfare between tech and barbarian states threatened the physical security of the repository. Perhaps most significantly, the human resources of the Order. The scholars, archists, and guardians dwindled as the surrounding culture grew more hostile to knowledge preservation. By the late 29th millennium, approximately 5 centuries before the Unification Wars began in earnest, the Order had been reduced to fewer than 100 members. At some point, the sigil sites were forced to abandon outer sections of the fortress, concentrating their dwindling resources on preserving only the most essential. Repositories. Some imperial analysis show that the fortress came under direct attack multiple times during this period. Defense systems dating to the Dark Age of technology had long since failed, forcing the sigil sites to rely on more primitive measures. Skeletal remains discovered during the Imperial Palace construction show that many Sigillite died defending against Techien barbarian raids. By the time the warlord would become the emperor, began his early conquests, Bram Alador stood as the last fully initiated member of the Order. He had maintained a small group of acolytes and guardians recruited from nearby mountain communities, but these individuals lacked the complete training and knowledge of true sigil sites. The continuity of the Order, maintained for thousands of years, had finally been broken. The first documented meeting between Bra Alador and the Emperor of Mankind remains shrouded in conflicting accounts. What can be established with reasonable certainty is that this meeting occurred approximately 798 years before the completion of the Unification Wars, during the emperor's early consolidation of power in the region, once known as Asia. The Terran Unification Memorial in the Outer Palace complex shows this meeting in stylized form, showing the emperor ascended the mountain path to the Sigillite fortress alone, though he was likely accompanied by an early group of Protoc custodian guards. The same memorial shows Malcador greeting the emperor at the fortress gates, according to the fragmentary records of conversations between the emperor and his earliest advisors. It was during this first meeting that Malcador suggested the title emperor to the then warlord. The transcript quotes Malcador, "You seek to unite humanity, not merely conquer it." History tells us that those who achieve such unification are remembered, not as kings or dictators, but as emperors. You would be not just the ruler of Terra, but the emperor of mankind. What is certain is that following this meeting, Malcador, now beginning to use the name Malcador, became one of the emperor's most trusted advisors. His knowledge of pre-strife Terra proved invaluable in the early unification campaigns, providing insights into forgotten technologies, lost geographical features, and the cultural histories of regions the emperor sought to bring into compliance. More significantly, Malcador appears to have provided the emperor with access to the full repositories of the Sigillite fortress inventory records. From this period show a systematic evaluation of the preserved knowledge, with particular attention paid to scientific and technological information that could aid the unification efforts. The genetic samples from the Gorham repository were transferred to newly established Imperial biological research facilities, later contributing to terraforming efforts and the restoration of certain Terran ecosystems. The alliance between these two ancient beings, both possessing extraordinary psychic abilities, both having witnessed the rise and fall of human civilization, would prove to be one of the most consequential partnerships in human history. From it would emerge the administrative, cultural, and philosophical foundations of the Imperium that endures to this day. In the decades that followed their meeting, Malcador would transition from Therol of Keeper of humanity's past to the architect of its future. The last Sigillite would become the first Lord of Terra, bringing the preservation ethos of his ancient order into the construction of an empire intended to span in the stars once more. It is worth noting that sections regarding certain conversations between Malcador and the Emperor concerning the nature of the warp and potential atrocities committed by the Sigillite during the Age of Strife have been redacted by Order of the Order, Malus Clearance, Level Alpha Primus required for access to complete text. The unification wars that brought Terra under the Emperor's rule in the late 30th millennium represent one of the most extensively documented periods of Imperial history. Chronicles of the Thunder Warriors' victories, the technological marvels, unearthed from the vaults of Mars, and the Emperor's personal triumphs against the barbarian warlords fill volumes in the Imperial archives. Yet in these official histories, Malcador is often reduced to a footnote, the loyal advisor who stood at the Emperor's side, despite having been the primary architect of the administrative and governmental systems that transformed the Emperor's military conquests into a sustainable empire. The unification wars lasted approximately 250 Terran years, beginning with the Emperor's first major victories in the Indonesian bloc, and concluding with the Treaty of Mars that brought the Mechanicum into Imperial compliance. Throughout this period, Moldor's influence can be traced in three distinct but interconnected spheres: military strategy, governmental development, and cultural integration. Turning to psychic ability, the Emperor's psychic power rightfully dominates Imperial histories, but Moldor's own considerable psychic abilities played a crucial role during the unification period. Unlike many powerful psychers whose abilities manifested in specific domains, such as combat divination or telepathy, Malcador demonstrated remarkable versatility. Similarly interesting is that while typical telepathic communication requires line of sight or close proximity, Malcador demonstrated the ability to maintain clear communication with agents across continental distances. This ability facilitated the coordination of simultaneous military actions across Terra, giving Imperial forces a significant strategic advantage over their regionally limited opponents. In addition, multiple accounts describe Maldor's ability to temporarily suppress or alter memories. This talent was employed in diplomatic negotiations with particularly difficult barbarian leaders, allowing for peaceful compliance in situations where military action would have proven costly. The ethical implications of this ability have been extensively debated by later Imperial scholars, though such discussions remain restricted to the highest levels of the Inquisition, and perhaps most significantly for the early Imperium. Malcador demonstrated the incredible ability to create psychic wards protecting significant areas from warp-based interference, as documented in an early Imperial survey of warp conditions. These protections were crucial in an era when uncontrolled psychers and warp incursions remained common. What distinguished Malcador from other powerful psychers of the era was not raw power. The Emperor Magnus the Red and several others exceeded him in this regard, but rather his control and endurance. Where many psychers of comparable strength faced mental instability or warp corruption, Malcador maintained perfect control for millennia. His military contributions are also worthy of some note. Imperial military documents outline several critical junctures during the Unification Wars, where Maldor's direct intervention proved decisive during the siege of Verton Hold, when Imperial forces became trapped in the labyrinthine tunnels beneath this Nord Afric fortress. Malcador is recorded as having established telepathic links with each squad commander, simultaneously coordinating their movements and enabling a synchronized breakthrough that captured the previously impregnable fortress in a single day. Similarly, in the Battle of the Caucasus Wastes, when a previously unknown weapon was used by the SH forces to overwhelm the Imperial vanguard, Malcador reportedly created a psychic barrier that contained the weapon's effects long enough for Imperial forces to withdraw Andre Group. There are also accounts of the Sigillite using his power as an offensive weapon, although these are far fewer in number in the pacification of the Barrowan lowlands. There are texts that record this as one of the few occasions where Malcador directly employed his psychic abilities in an offensive capacity when negotiation failed with the ruling witch judges of Bossia. Users of forbidden psychic technologies, Malcador engaged their leader in what records describe as a battle of minds. The conflict resulted in the neutralization of the enemy and the peaceful compliance of their territory, sparing a region known for its agricultural productivity from the devastation of conventional warfare as the Unification Wars drew to a close circa 840 M30. The Emperor's attention increasingly turned toward the stars. The warp storms that had isolated Terra from millennia were beginning to abate, and preparations for the Great Crusade were well underway. It was during this transition period that Maldor's role was formally codified, the decree of regency preserved in the Imperial Palace's Sanctum Imperialis officially established Malcador as the first Lord of Terra and regent in the Emperor's absence. This document, bearing the Emperor's personal seal, granted Malcador unprecedented authority, the power to issue edicts, allocate resources, and make binding decisions on all matters not explicitly reserved for the Emperor himself. The administrative structures Malcador had built during the Unification Wars were consolidated into what would become the Council of Terra, the first centralized governing body of the Imperium. The Council integrated military, administrative, economic, and judicial functions under a single authority, with Malcador at its head. Perhaps most significantly, the decree of regency included the Sigillum Imperialis, the imperial seal that Malcador was empowered to use in the Emperor's name. This physical token of authority is the origin of Maldor's title, the Sigillite transforming, a reference to his ancient order into a formal recognition of his role as the emperor's voice and hand. The role was a necessity in many ways. While the emperor and his primarch would lead the military reconquest of the stars, Malcador would ensure that the Imperium developed the institutional strength and administrative continuity to govern those conquests. The division of responsibilities recognized that military conquest alone would not be enough to rebuild human civilization governance. Culture and administration were equally essential. In his first address as First Lord, Malcador articulated a vision that would guide his regency. The emperor conquers with the sword, but we shall govern with the pen. His victories bring worlds into the Imperium, our labours shall make those worlds truly imperial. This philosophy that military conquest and administrative integration were complementary aspects of the same grand project would define the early Imperium. The transition from the unification of terror to the Great Crusade represented one of the most significant logistical challenges in human history. The task of expanding a planetary government to an interstellar empire capable of reclaiming thousands of human-settled worlds required administrative framework works of an immense scope and flexibility. This undertaking was primarily Maldor's responsibility, while the emperor focused on military strategy and the recovery of his scattered primarchs. The imperial expansion protocols, drafted by Malcador, established the foundational administrative systems that would support the Great Crusade's rapid expansion. This document, preserved in fragmentary form in the Administratum archives, reveals Maldor's remarkable foresight in addressing challenges that would only become apparent decades later. Most significant among these protocols was the establishment of the Iterators' Corps at the beginning of the Great Crusade. These trained orators, diplomats, and cultural specialists accompanied expeditionary fleets to facilitate peaceful compliance of human worlds and cultural integration into the Imperium. Recruitment records show that Malcador personally selected many of the early iterators from scholars, diplomats, and historians who had served during the Unification Wars, ensuring that the cultural aspects of imperial expansion received proper consideration alongside military conquest. The establishment of the imperial tithe system around the same time proved equally crucial to the Crusade's sustainability. This was essentially a standardized assessment process for newly found worlds that balanced resource extraction with economic development, a stark contrast to the exploitative practices that would emerge in later millennia. The original TIE assessment templates bearing Maldor's personal seal included provisions for infrastructure development, knowledge exchange, and technological uplift alongside resource quotas. Alongside all of this was the creation of the Divisio Administratum, which established standardized governance models for newly compliant worlds, rather than imposing a single template. This system offered graduated levels of imperial integration based on a world's technological development, cultural compatibility, and strategic importance. This flexible approach enabled the rapid absorption of thousands of human-settled worlds without overwhelming the imperial bureaucracy or their native populations as the Great Crusade continued to push outward from terror. The emperor's direct involvement in governance necessarily diminished, and the systems put in place by Malcador began to show their value from 840 M30. The emperor was physically present on Terra for less than 30 Terran days per standard year, spending the majority of his time leading expeditionary fleets or searching for his scattered primarchs. While Maldor's primary responsibility during the Great Crusade was imperial governance, he also helped to shape the primarchs. As they were discovered, these encounters reveal much about both Maldor's diplomatic skills and the early character development of these transhuman generals. The most extensively documented relationship was between Malcador and Leman Russ Primarch of the Space Wolves, following Russ's discovery on Fenris. The Emperor assigned Malcador to serve as the Wolf King's tutor and guide to imperial society. This unusual assignment, given Moldor's numerous other responsibilities, suggests the emperor recognized a particular need to temper Russ's feral nature with cultural and historical context. Malcador patiently explained advanced technologies, imperial protocols, and the strategic objectives of the Great Crusade to the Fenrisian Primarch, suggesting a genuine bond formed between the ancient piker and the pharaoh warrior, despite their radically different natures. One observer noted, the Sigillite speaks to the war as a grandfather might to a favored grandchild, with affection tempered by wisdom and occasional stern correction. Moldor's interactions with other Primarchs varied considerably in both frequency and tenor. Archival records indicate cordial but limited contact with Rogaldorn, Sanguinius, and Ferris Manus, whose practical natures aligned well with Malcador administrative focus. Conversely, his documented exchanges with Magnus the Red were extensive but often contentious, primarily centered on the proper application and regulation of psychic abilities. Most revealing are the meetings and communications with Robu Gilman. Here we often see an evolving relationship built on mutual respect for governance and statecraft, with extensive discussions of administrative systems and civilian infrastructure development. Many of the governance innovations later attributed to Gilan on Ultramar show clear influence from administrative systems Malcador had established on Terra. Notable by their absence are records of interactions between Malcador and several Primarchs who would later turn traitor, particularly Horus FM and Perturabo. Whether this indicates actual limited contact or subsequent redaction of records remains a subject of scholarly debate among imperial historians. The following section is adapted from the Inquisitorial Historical Analysis, Prelude to Betrayal, classified Villon Omega, with supplementary material from the Librarius Omnis and fragmentary records of the Council of Nika. As the Great Crusade reached its heights in the early decades of the 31st millennium, the Imperium of Man appeared to be at the height of its power and glory. Hundreds of expeditionary fleets pushed ever outward into the galaxy, bringing dozens of human-settled worlds into compliance. Each month the heirs, led by the Emperor's Primarchs, achieved military victories that would become legendary. However, the machinations of humanity were not all positive. Beneath this veneer of triumph, subtle indicators of future catastrophe were becoming apparent to those with the insight to recognize them. There is evidence to suggest that Mal, or the Sigillite, was among the first to detect these warning signs. His position at the nexus of imperial governance, combined with his exceptional psychic sensitivity and millennia of experience observing human nature, gave him a unique perspective on the underlying tensions developing within the Imperium's power structures. The Chronic Imperialists, a meticulously maintained administrative record of the Great Crusade period, documents Malcador growing cons turns as early as 940 M30, more than 60 standard years before the outbreak of open rebellion. Entries during this period show a marked increase in Moldor's requests for detailed reports on various expeditionary fleets, particularly those led by the Primarch La Angren and Conrad Kerr. These requests, ostensibly made for standard administrative purposes, appear in retrospect to have been early monitoring of conning behavioral patterns. More telling are the sealed psychic communications between Malcador and the Emperor, partially preserved in the Librarius Omnis. These fragmentary records reveal Malcador repeatedly bringing concerning reports to the Emperor's attention. Excessive civilian casualties during compliance actions, deviations from established imperial protocols, and increasingly erratic behavior among certain Primarchs. The Emperor's responses were preserved, generally counsel patience, or suggest that such matters would be addressed directly with the Primarch in question. The compliance action against the world of Kor and the subsequent destruction of its capital city Monarchia in approximately 964 ML30 gives us details into one of the most significant precursors to the Horus heresy, while official imperial histories focus on the Emperor's harsh punishment of the word bearers for their violation of the Imperial Truth documentary. Evidence reveals Malcador, substantial involvement in both the decision and its implementation. The Monarchia Disposition, a classified military directive, bears both the Emperor's seal and Moldor's countersignature. This document not only orders the destruction of Monarchia, but outlines a strategy for dismantling the religious structures that the word bearers had established across dozens of worlds. The document's detailed knowledge of word-bearer activities suggests extensive prior intelligence, gathering an operation that must have been conducted under Maldor's authority as imperial region. Most significantly, Malcador was physically present at Monarchia during the Emperor's direct chastisement of La and his legion. The Ultramarines Battle Chronicle of this event describes Malcador standing at the Emperor's side as the Primarch, and his legion were forced to kneel in the ashes of the city they had built. This rare instance of Malcador leaving terror during the Great Crusade underscores the gravity with which both he and the Emperor viewed the word bearer's divergence from imperial doctrine. In his subsequent report to the Council of Terra, Malcador described the Monarchia censure as regrettably necessary, but potentially insufficient to redirect the Primarch's energies toward more productive channels. This assessment would prove tragically prescient, as later events would reveal that the humiliation of Monarchia pushed La not toward compliance, but toward active search for alternative powers to serve. Another spark that pushed a Primarch further away from the Imperium was the Council of Nicaea that convened in approximately 96-67 M30 to address the growing controversy over the use of psychic powers within the Astars. This council was another critical moment where Malcador attempted to mitigate emerging threats to imperial stability. While official histories focus on the Emperor's ruling that restricted the use of psychic abilities within the legions, Malcador had significant behind-the-scenes influence. The Nika transcripts in the Archives of the Grey Knights chapter explain Mal's testimony before the assembled Primarchs and Legion representatives. His presentation outlined both the potential benefits of controlled psychic development and the catastrophic risks of unregulated psychic activity. Most notably, Malcador advocated not for the complete prohibition of psychic powers, but for a rigorous system of training and oversight, a middle path between the positions advocated by Magnus, the Red and Mortarian communications between Malcador and several Primarchs. In the days preceding the council reveal the Silly's attempt to build consensus for this moderate approach. These records show Malcador specifically warning that an outright ban would simply drive psychic practices underground, where they would develop without proper safeguards or supervision. The eventual categorical prohibition issued by the Emperor thus appears to have been contrary to Moldor's recommendations. Perhaps most significant was Moldor's proposal of the Librarian Edict, which would establish a group of specifically trained and monitored psyo-artists within each legion. These librarians would serve both as battlefield assets and as monitors for psychic or warp-based threats. While this proposal was initially rejected as part of the Nika decree, it would eventually be implemented in modified form after the Horus heresy, suggesting that Moldor's concerns had been well-founded. In a sealed report to the Emperor following the council, Malcador wrote, "The suppression of knowledge is rarely preferable to its proper regulation. I fear we have closed our eyes rather than learning to see clearly." Throughout the later decades of the Great Crusade, administrative records show Malcador implementing a series of monitoring programs focused on specific Primarchs and their legions. These programs, ostensibly established for standard administrative oversight, reveal a pattern of growing concern about the loyalty and stability of certain primarchs. The compliance assessments, a series of classified reports commissioned by Malcador between 960 to 970, evaluated each legion's adherence to imperial protocols during compliance actions. These assessments, conducted by trusted ITators embedded within expeditionary fleets, paid particular attention to civilian casualty rates treatment of compliant populations and implementation of imperial governance systems. The reports on the World Ears Night Lords and Death Guard legions consistently highlighted concerning deviations from established protocols. Of particular note was the Crusade Command Structure Analysis of 969 AM30, which examined the growing independence of certain primarchs from direct imperial oversight. This report, compiled from Astropath Communications administrative reports and first-hand accounts from imperial officials, documented the increasing tendency of Horus FM Perabo and several other primarchs to operate with minimal reference to terror. The analysis specifically warned of the dangers inherent in allowing expeditionary fleets to become personal F-arms of their primarch commanders, rather than integrated components of a unified imperial military. Most revealing are the private communications between Malcador and Rogel Dawn, preserved in the Imperial Fists archives. In one such exchange, Malcador expresses specific concerns about Horus's ambition, Angron's mental instability, Logger's religious tendencies, and Conrad K's increasingly extreme methods of establishing compliance. Dawn's responses generally defend his brothers, while acknowledging some of these concerns, a tension that reflects the broader conflict between primer autonomy and central imperial authority. These documented concerns demonstrate that, contrary to some later historical revisionism, the heresy did not strike an unsuspecting Imperium, at least at the highest levels of imperial governance. The potential for Primarch rebellion had been identified, even if the specific form and timing of that rebellion remained unforeseen. The Emperor's decision to return to Terra in approximately 970 Men 30, leaving Horus as Warm to lead. The continuing Great Crusade is something of a turning point in imperial history, both with regards to the project he began to work on and with the power granted to Horus, while many accounts focus on the military implications of this transition. Malcador responsibilities also grew with the Emperor's effective withdrawal from public imperial life. The warrant of regency issued at this time granted Malcador unprecedented authority over all civilian aspects of imperial governance. This document essentially formalized what had been developing throughout the Great Crusade, the division of imperial leadership between the Emperor's direct control of military and technological advancement and Malcador oversight of administrative and civilian matters. The formation of the Council of Terror during this period further consolidated Maldor's authority. This governing body, consisting primarily of civilian administrators rather than military leaders, was explicitly tasked with managing the Imperium, while the Emperor focused on his mysterious project, and the Primer led the ongoing military expansion. The exclusion of Primer Reaper representatives from this council would later be cited as a contributing factor to the heresy, creating a perception that civilian bureaucrats were usurping authority. From the generals who had conquered the Imperium, astropath logs from this period show a significant increase in the frequency and urgency of communications between Terra and various expeditionary fleets, as Malcador attempted to maintain imperial cohesion. Despite the Emperor's physical and psychic withdrawal, these communications reveal growing tensions, particularly with Horus, who increasingly viewed Maldor's administrative directives as interference with his authority, as warm Maldor's psychic communications. With the Emperor show the Sigillite repeatedly raising concerns about these growing tensions, in one particularly stark message dated to approximately 972 AM30, Malcador warns The sons resent the father absence and mistrust those who speak in his name. I fear the structure we have built cannot long endure without your visible hand upon the helm. The Emperor's responses, where preserved, generally reassure Malcador that the work underway beneath the palace would ultimately secure humanity's future regardless of shorter-term difficulties. The true nature of the Emperor's great work would not be fully revealed until the heresy was already underway, the construction of a human extension into the webway that would free humanity from dependence on warp travel. Neither Malcador nor any other Imperial official outside the Emperor's most immediate circle understood the full scope of this project, leaving the Sigillite to manage growing Imperial tensions without crucial context for the Emperor's withdrawal. This period of expanded regency placed Malcador in an untenable position, vested with the authority to govern the Imperium but lacking the charisma of the Emperor or his primer, and deprived of complete information about the Emperor's ultimate objectives. That the Imperium continued to function and expand during these years is a nod to Malcador's administrative skill, even as the seeds of catastrophe grew. Beyond his direct sight, the first confirmed reports of Horus's betrayal reached Terra in approximately 5 M31, brought by the Death Guard frigate Eisenstein and its small crew of loyalist Estares, led by battle captain Nathaniel Gu. The vessel was intercepted by Imperial fist ships in the Outer Sol system, and its occupants were immediately placed under guard and quarantine. While their claims were investigated, Malcador personally conducted the questioning of Go and his companions, including the remembrance of Euphrat Keeler. These sessions, which extended over several weeks, were remarkable for their thoroughness and Malcador's use of both conventional interrogation techniques and subtle psychic verification of the subject's truthfulness after confirming the veracity of their account, particularly the massacre of loyal Space Marines at East Van 3. Malcador immediately instituted what administrative records refer to as contingent protocol, Hereticus, a comprehensive emergency response that included a communications blackout, restricting information about the rebellion to the highest levels of Imperial leadership, the recall of the Imperial Fists Legion to Terra to begin strengthening the planet's defenses. This also prompted the dispatch of secure astropath messages to potentially loyal Primarchs and Legion commanders, and the activation of previously established intelligence networks. Within all Arti legions, most significantly Malcador, appears to have implemented these measures before informing the Emperor of the confirmed betrayal. He met with the Emperor in the secure zones beneath the Imperial Palace approximately 36 hours after concluding his interrogation of the Eisenstein survivors. This delay, while brief, suggests that Malcador had been authorized to initiate emergency protocols at his own discretion, a remarkable level of delegated authority, even for the Imperial region. The immediate aftermath of this meeting saw a dramatic acceleration of defenses around Terra, with Rogel Dawn being formally appointed Praetorian and tasked with fortifying the Imperial Palace against potential attack. Malcador, meanwhile, turned his full attention to gathering intelligence and developing asymmetric responses to the threat posed by the traitor forces. Malcador began many actions after learning of the heresy. One among them was the formal establishment of the Officio Assassinorumus. An official Imperial institution, assassin operatives had been employed on a limited basis throughout the Great Crusade, but the outbreak of the heresy prompted a significant expansion and formalization of these covert capabilities. The Charter of Operational Authority, issued by Malc in mid-5 M31, established the Officio as an independent agency, reporting directly to him. This document authorized the recruitment, training, and deployment of specialized assassins against targets deemed to represent existential threats to the Imperium. This project resulted in the rapid expansion of training facilities in the most secure regions of the Imperial Palace complex and the creation of specialized environments for what would later be recognized as the distinct assassination temples, or clades these were, the Vindicare Temple, focusing on precision, long-range elimination, the Cardus Temple, specializing in infiltration and impersonation, the Collars Temple developing assassination capabilities, the Eversa Temple creating berserker combat operatives. The first formal assassin deployments were directed not against Horus himself, but against key support infrastructure. Within the traitor forces, these initial operations targeted supply chains, communication hubs, and recruitment facilities, disrupting the traitors' logistical capabilities while avoiding direct confrontation with the Primarchs or their arties. This approach changed dramatically following the drop site massacre at East Van 5, where 3 loyal legions were all but destroyed by the traitors' treachery. Immediately following confirmation of this catastrophe, Malcador convened the first meeting of what historical documents refer to as the Concilium Operatus, a secret directorate that would later evolve into the Assassinorum ruling body. The most ambitious and controversial deployment of the Nentaficio Assassinorum was undoubtedly Operation Nemesis, the coordinated attempt to eliminate Horus himself. While much of the operation remains classified, even after 10 millennia, certain details have emerged through various historical sources. The Nemesis Directive, bearing both the Emperor's seal and Moldor's countersignature, authorized the deployment of operatives from all assassination clades in a coordinated strike against the Worm. This extraordinary measure committing virtually every type of imperial assassin to a single target underscores the threat that Horus represented to the Imperium. The operation itself was planned and coordinated personally by Malcador, working with the masters of the various assassination clades. The assassins were dispatched in mid-6 M31 at a time. When Horus's forces were regrouping following the drop site massacre, while the operation failed to eliminate Horus, several high-ranking traitor officers were killed during the attempt. More significantly, the operation appears to have forced Horus to implement extensive security measures that restricted his movements and limited his direct involvement in military operations, potentially buying valuable time for imperial defensive preparations. In the failure of Operation Nemesis, there was a tactical shift in assassination deployments rather than concentrating resources on high-value but heavily protected targets, like the traitor Primarch. Future operations focused on more accessible command figures and key infrastructure. This adjustment would characterize the officio activities throughout the remainder of the heresy, with hundreds of documented operations disrupting traitor supply lines, eliminating key commanders, and sowing discord within rebel forces. While these efforts could not prevent the traitor advance toward Terra, they significantly delayed it and reduced its overall effectiveness. Among the most secretive of Malcador initiatives during the heresy was the formation of a specialized group of loyalist space marines drawn from various legions, including those that had turned traitor. These operatives became known as the Knights. Aaron thought they operated without formal designation during the heresy itself. The creation of this group can be traced to Moldor's interaction with battle captain Nathaniel Gu following the Eisenstein incident, rather than reassigning Go to a loyalist legion. Our records show that Malcador placed him under direct command of the Sigillite's personal household with the designation Agent Primus. The operational directives issued to Garrow tasked him with identifying and recruiting other Space Marines of unquestionable loyalty, particularly those from legions that had turned traitor. These directives emphasized psychological stability, resistance to corruption, and absolute dedication to the Emperor as essential qualities for recruits. The Knights Errand operated from a secure facility within the Imperial Palace complex, separate from both the regular Artis barracks and the Assassinorum training grounds. They had access to specialized equipment designed for covert operations, including modified power armor, with identification markings removed, and communication systems independent of standard Legion channels' operational records, while highly fragmentary document knights-errant deployments across the embattled galaxy during the middle years of the Heresy. These missions included their covering operations to extract loyalist arties trapped behind enemy lines, intelligence gathering in traitor-controlled territories, the elimination of key traitor support, personnel sabotage and countering war-based threats that conventional forces were equipped to handle, perhaps most significant ways the Knights-Errant operation on Molech. This high-risk mission aimed to assassinate Horus during a moment of vulnerability as he conducted a ritual at a warp gate on that world. While the operation ultimately failed, it represented one of the closest approaches to the arch-traitor achieved by any Imperial operatives during the Heresy, the recruitment criteria I kept locked in. The archives of the Grey Knights chapter show us Maldor's exacting standards for these selections for the artist candidates. He required not only unquestionable loyalty and combat prowess, but also significant psychic potential, exceptional mental resilience, and complete incorruptibility. For the mortal candidates, he sought individuals with analytical brilliance, unwavering dedication to humanity's survival, and the courage to make difficult decisions without hesitation. As we've seen, Maldor's willingness to recruit from both loyalist and traitor legions was remarkable. Of the 8 Space Marines eventually selected, several came from legions that had turned to Horus, including the Thousand Suns World Eaters and Lunar Wolves. This controversial decision, which caused significant concern among certain loyalist commanders, was justified by Malcador on the grounds that those who had witnessed the corruption of their brothers firsthand and remained loyal were uniquely valuable in understanding the threat. The selection process appears to have been conducted primarily through the Knights-Errant operations, with Battle Captain Nathaniel Gu serving as Maldor's primary recruiter. Operational logs document numerous extraction missions to retrieve potential candidates from combat zones, traitor-controlled territories, and even detention facilities where loyalists from traitor legions were being held by approximately 11 M31. As the traitor forces began their push toward the Sol system Malcador had assembled. His chosen group among the Space Marines were members from the Thousand Suns Death Guard, Ultramarines, Word-Bearers, and World Eaters. The group also include a former Iterator, a Sister of Silence Remembrancer, and other members whose backgrounds have been classified. The assembly of this group represents one of Maldor's most remarkable achievements during the Heresy, identifying and extracting these individuals from across a galaxy in flames while maintaining such secrecy that even most high-ranking Imperial officials remained unaware of their existence. Many believe that this group was the foundation what would become the Grey Knights chapter, a specialized force of psychic Space Marines designed specifically to combat demonic entities. Planning for this organization began as early as 8 M31, though implementation accelerated dramatically as the traitor forces approached Terra. The Titan Directive authorized the establishment of a secret fortress monastery on Saturn's moon Titan. The construction of this facility began well before the siege of Terra, with specialized materials and equipment being transported to Titan via heavily guarded convoys throughout 11 and 12 M31. Most remarkable was the technological and psychic sophistication of this installation. The fortress incorporated advanced warp shielding technologies, psychic amplification systems, and containment facilities designed for demonic entities, all significantly beyond the standard Imperial capabilities of the period. Malcador drew upon both his ancient knowledge from the age of technology and the Emperor's own designs to create these systems. Equally significant was the specialized gene seed developed for the Grey Knights' biological analysis conducted by the Adeptus Mechanicus in 32 confirmed that this gene seed was distinct from that of any existing legion, incorporating unique modifications specifically designed to enhance psychic abilities While providing exceptional resistance to warp corruption, this gene seed may have incorporated genetic material from the Emperor, himself an unprecedented development in space marine creation. The training regimen designed by Malcador for these new arties established a system that integrated combat training, psychic development, and spiritual conditioning into a comprehensive program, unlike anything previously implemented. Central to this system was the concept of true knowledge, that Grey Knights would be fully aware of the threats they face, rather than operating in the ignorance that had been imposed on most Imperial forces during the Great Crusade. In the final days before the Siege of Terra, Malcador personally transported his 8 chosen Space Marines to Titan, using his formidable psychic powers to conceal the moon within a pocket of the warp. This extraordinary measure, effectively removing Titan from real space for the duration of the heresy, ensured that the fledgling Grey Knights would survive regardless of the outcome on Terra, securing them against the possibility of total Imperial defeat at roughly the same time as the establishment of the Grey Knights was Maldor's design for what would eventually become the Imperial Inquisition, a decentralized organization dedicated to identifying and eliminating threats to humanity, whether Xenos, demonic or internal, while this institution would not be formally established until after the heresy. Malcador laid its conceptual and operational foundations during the conflict's later stages. The Hereticus Mandate outlines Maldor's vision for this organization. Unlike the structured hierarchy of imperial military and administrative bodies, the proposed institution would operate as a network of independent agents, each empowered with extraordinary authority, but subject to peer oversight. This structure was deliberately designed to prevent centralized corruption and to ensure that no single compromise could undermine the entire organization. Perhaps most controversial was the authority Malcador proposed for these agents. The mandate explicitly states that they would operate outside normal imperial command structures, answerable only to the Emperor himself, with the power to requisition any imperial resources deemed necessary to combat identified threats. This authority, which would eventually be codified in the inquisitorial mandate, represented a radical departure from the centralized command structure that had characterized the Great Crusade. Era training of the 4 chosen mortals from the Knights Errant appears to have been conducted within a secure facility in the Imperial Palace, complex referred to in administrative records as the Sigillite Sanctum. This facility contained extensive archives of forbidden knowledge, including information about chaos that had been deliberately suppressed during the Great Crusade. By providing his chosen agents with this knowledge, Malcador ensured they would understand the true nature of the threats they would face before the Inquisition's formal establishment. Maldor's chosen agents were actively conducting investigations throughout Loyalist territory, identifying potential security vulnerabilities, and developing the methodologies that would later become standard inquisitorial practice. These early operations appear to have focused particularly on detecting chaos influence within imperial institutions, a threat that the pre-heresy Imperium had been ill-equipped to recognize. Most significant was Maldor's insistence that this new organization maintain formal ties with the Grey Knights while remaining operationally independent. The coordination protocols established during this period, which continued to govern interaction between the Inquisition and Grey Knights, ensured that each institution would complement the other, the Inquisition identifying threats that the Grey Knights would then neutralize. It seems that in all of his planning, Malcador aimed to set up these systems that would operate without him, and in the event of his death, the succession to directives designated specific individuals to assume leadership of various projects. Specifically, in the event of his death, these directives included detailed instructions for contacting the hidden Grey Knights on Titan protocols, for establishing formal inquisitorial authority, and even guidance for interacting with a potentially incapacitated Emperor. Malcador also created an archive of classified information. This repository, hidden within multiple secure locations throughout Terra, contained essential knowledge about chaos, Xenos threats, prohibited technologies, as well as other dangers that his successor organizations would need to fulfill their missions. These archives incorporated both conventional documentation and psychically imprinted information accessible only to those with specific training. Interestingly, and perhaps due to his psychic ability, communications between Malcador and several of his chosen agents reveal his awareness of his likely fate. This clear-eyed acceptance of his own mortality, combined with his methodical preparation for the Imperium that would follow, is a showing sign of the foresight and selfless dedication that characterized Maldor's service, while the Emperor's sacrifice on the Golden Throne would rightfully become the defining martyrdom of Imperial history. Maldor's quieter self-sacrifice in establishing the institutions that would preserve humanity was perhaps equally crucial to the Imperium's survival. We'll next look at the Siege of Terra. Much of this section is taken from the Imperial Fist's Chronicle of the Last Defiance, with supplementary material from the personal journals of Rodon and the classified custodian records of the Golden Throne as the forces of the Warm Horus completed their advance through the Sol system in early 014 M31. The defense of Terra entered its final and most critical phase, while many accounts rightly emphasize Primar Rogal Dorn's monumental work in physically fortifying the Imperial Palace. Malcador had an equally vital role in preparing Terra for the coming siege. Both Dor and Malcador created a comprehensive and integrated defensive strategy that extended far beyond physical fortifications. This included military defense, civilian management, resource allocation, and psychic defense. While Daor maintained primary authority over military deployments, Malcador took direct responsibility for the other domains, with contingency plans addressing hundreds of potential scenarios, from food shortages to demonic incursions. Equally as important was Maldor's work in creating the A Sanctum of the Imperial Palace, where the Emperor continued his work on the Golden Throne and the Human Webway project. This included physical and psychic barriers, custodian guard deployments, and emergency teleportation systems linked to the Emperor's chambers in a similar way to the Knights Errant base of operations on the Moon of Titan. This inner sanctum required technology that was designed from Maldor's knowledge of ancient pre-strife information, as traitor forces secured their position in the Sol system and began their approach to Terra. Malcador convened a series of high-level strategy councils with the loyal Primarchs present on Terra, Rogal Dorn, Sanguinius, and Jagatai Khan. Malcador seemed to have used this time to balance the sometimes conflicting perspectives of these transhuman generals. He also discussed the strategic situation, braying the defenders of Terra. It required a level of honesty about the defenders, disadvantages being outnumbered in both artisan conventional forces, lacking void superiority, and facing enemies with significant war-based capabilities, rather than surrendering to fatalism. However, Maldor's assessment identified a number of strategic advantages that could be leveraged: the defensive fortifications of the Imperial Palace, the presence of the Emperor and his psychic power, the exceptional quality of the defending forces, and most significantly, the likelihood that Horus would be compelled to seek a decisive confrontation rather than settling for a prolonged siege. There were, however, different strategic approaches advocated by each Primarch. Dorn favored a static defense focused on the palace itself. Jagatai Khan argued for mobile forces that could strike at vulnerable points in the traitor lines, while Sanguinius emphasized the need to counter the unique threat posed by the traitor Primarch themselves. Maldor's greatest contribution was not advocating for any single approach, but rather synthesizing these perspectives into an integrated strategy that employed each Primarch according to their strengths. The Imperial Fists would anchor the static defenses of the palace itself. The White Scars would maintain mobile forces capable of counter-attacking vulnerable sectors, and the Blood Angels would be positioned as a strategic reserve, ready to counter high-value threats including the traitor. Primarch, perhaps most significant, was Maldor's insistence on establishing clear command protocols for various contingencies, including the potential loss of one or more loyal Primarchs. These protocols would prove crucial during the chaotic later stages of the siege, when communications were disrupted. Ed and key commanders were engaged in critical combat actions in the final days before traitors made planetfall on Terra historical records. Document a series of more private meetings between Malcador and each of the loyal Primarchs, while the full content of these conversations remains unknown. Fragmentary accounts preserved in various Imperial archives suggest that Malcador provided both strategic counsel and personal guidance tailored to each Primarch's nature and the specific challenges they would face. The meeting with Rogel Dawn appears to have focused on the burden of command and the necessity of making decisions that would cost countless lives. Dawn's own writing reads, "The Sigillite reminded me that wars protect both through their strength and through the sacrifice they represent. Every stone, like every life, placed precisely where it must be." Maldor's counsel to Sanguinius addressed the Primarch's prophetic visions of his own death. According to these accounts, Malcador neither confirmed nor denied these premonitions, but instead emphasized that the manner of one's end matters less than what that end secures. For others, this perspective appears to have strengthened Sanguinius's resolve to face whatever fate awaited him. The exchange with Jagai Khan centered on the tension between the Khan's desire for direct confrontation with the traitors and the strategic necessity of preserving his forces for critical moments. Malcador reportedly told the Khan that the greatest speed is knowing when to wait, and the perfect strike comes only to those who recognize the moment that demands it. Malcador also met with Constantina Valdor, Captain General of the Custodian Guard. While not a Primarch, Valdor would bear the tremendous responsibility of defending the Emperor himself. Malcador told Valdor that they both share a duty beyond victory or defeat should all else fall. The Emperor must survive. Valor's sword protects his person. Maldor's sacrifice will preserve his purpose. While the physical aspects of the Siege of Terra, the battles for the spaceports, the outer walls, and eventually the palace itself are extensively documented in Imperial histories, Maldor's crucial role in the psychic dimension of the conflict has received less attention. We know that the Sigillite was engaged in a constant, exhausting struggle against warp-based threats. Throughout the siege, Maldor's efforts were critical to maintain the Emperor's Astronomicon, while the Master of Mankind focused increasingly on containing the damaged webway portal beneath the palace. This task, which would normally require the coordinated efforts of thousands of psychers, fell primarily to Malcador, as other psychic resources were diverted to battlefield support and counterintelligence. The Sisters of Silence wrote about multiple instances of coordinated war-based attacks against the palace's defenses. These included sophisticated attempts to weaken the fabric of reality around the palace, potentially allowing direct warp incursions, while Malcador himself defended against these attacks. Perhaps most demanding was Maldor's maintenance of the psychic wards, protecting the Sanctum Imperialis itself. There were multiple occasions when surges of warp energy threatened to breach these wards, requiring Maldor's direct intervention to reinforce them. These incidents typically align with large traitor advances and the deployment of significant warp-based weapons. This suggests a coordinated strategy to breach the palace's psychic defenses. Medical reports, prepared by palace staff, document the physical toll these efforts took on Malcador. Despite his perpetual nature, these reports note increasing signs of strain, including nosebeds, tremors, and periods of disorientation following particularly intense psychic activity. Most concerning were observations of age acceleration, the appearance that Malcador's perpetual rejuvenation was being overwhelmed by the psychic demands placed upon him. Despite these strains, Malcador continued to fulfill his mundane governmental duties throughout much of the siege. He maintained regular strategic briefings with military commanders, managed resource allocation, As supply situations evolved and continued to issue directives addressing civilian needs as the siege reached its final hours in the assault on the inner palace, the fate of Terra and indeed humanity came to rest on a single critical decision. Horus lowered the void shields of his flagship vengeful spirit in an apparent invitation to direct confrontation. The Emperor eventually teleported aboard with a strike force of elite warriors to confront his fallen son directly. This decision presented an immediate strategic crisis. The Emperor's constant psychic effort was all that contained the damaged webway portal beneath the palace. Should that containment fail, even briefly, demonic entities would pour into the palace's heart, potentially rendering any victory against Horus meaningless. It was in this moment of crisis that Malcador made his final and greatest sacrifice. The Emperor asked if the Sigillite could maintain the Golden Throne temporarily, while he confronted Horus, despite full awareness that even the Emperor's superhuman psychic might was being strained by this task. Malcador agreed without hesitation. Malcador was connected to the throne systems at 0827 hours local time. The Emperor confirmed that the containment remained stable, departed with his strike force at 0830 hours. Biometric monitors recorded immediate signs of extreme stress in Malcador systems, but psychic containment readings remained within acceptable parameters. What these technical records cannot convey is the extraordinary nature of this achievement analysis by later Mechanicum. Psychotechnicians estimated that maintaining the Golden Throne represented a psychic effort equivalent to simultaneously shielding an entire planet from warp incursion, while in direct psychic combat with multiple greater demons that Malcador physically aged and already exhausted from. His efforts during the siege could sustain this burden for any length of time defies conventional understanding of human psychic capabilities. Yet sustain it, he did custodian logs, document Maldor's condition at hourly intervals throughout the Emperor's absence, progressive physical deterioration, episodes of psychic feedback causing visible pain, and by the later hours, evidence of cellular breakdown at the molecular level. Despite these effects, at no point did the webway containment falter through what must have been excruciating agony. Malcador maintained perfect control, holding back the tides of the warp through sheer will. The duration of this ordeal remains a subject of scholarly debate, with estimates ranging from 72 to 76 standard hours based on various imperial records. What is beyond dispute is that when the mortally wounded Emperor was returned to the palace following his confrontation with Horus, Malcador remained at his post, having literally burned away his physical substance in maintaining the throne. The final moments are documented with simple dignity in the personal record of Rogel Dawn. We removed the Sigillite. From the device his body crumbled to ash in my hands, yet before the end, he transferred his remaining life force to the Emperor, allowing him to speak to me one final time and give his instructions for what must follow. Thus did Malcador the Sigillite become Malcador the hero, his final service making possible all that would follow. This transfer of life, Energy Maldor's last gift to the Emperor, and through him to humanity, enabled the wounded master of mankind to briefly regain consciousness and issue the directives that would shape the Imperium for the next 10 millennia. Without this momentary clarity, the Emperor could not have provided the instructions necessary for his interment upon the Golden Throne, potentially dooming humanity to the very fate Malcador had worked so tirelessly to prevent in his final act. As throughout his long service, Malcador showed us the principle that had guided his existence, that individual sacrifice in service to humanity's survival was not just noble but necessary. It is worth noting that certain details regarding the technical functioning of the Golden Throne and the exact nature of the threat contained beyond the webway portal remain classified at the highest levels of imperial authority. The full extent of Maldor's psychic communication with the Emperor during the transition from the throne has been sealed by order of the High Lords of Terror. While Malcador himself had turned to ash, the institutional seeds he had planted began to germinate almost immediately. Following the heresy's conclusion, there was a gradual emergence of both the Grey Knights and what would eventually become the Inquisition, the twin pillars of Maldor's legacy, as Malcador had intended his psychic concealment of Saturn's moon dissolved. Following his death, revealing the fully established fortress Monas he had created, the Attis he had selected and secreted, there emerged with a new and unique purpose, a chapter of Space Marines specifically designed and trained to combat demonic entities. These Grey Knights immediately began recruiting and expanding. According to the protocols Malcador had established, Genanseed repositories, training programs, specialized equipment and tactical doctrines had all been prepared in advance, allowing the chapter to become operational with remarkable speed. Despite the chaotic conditions of the post-heresy Imperium, any comprehensive assessment of Maldor's contribution to humanity's survival must acknowledge both the magnitude of his achievement and the morally complex methods sometimes employed in its pursuit. Historical analysis spanning the millennia since his death reveals a figure of deep contradiction, a guardian of knowledge who sometimes practiced deliberate obscurantism, a champion of humanity who could order the deaths of millions in its defense, an administrator of civilian governance who created the most secretive and unaccountable agencies in imperial history, the Sigillite paradox, as it is termed in certain philosophical treatises of the Inquisition, lies in the tension between the idealistic vision of human potential that motivated Malcador's service and the often harsh pragmatism he employed in pursuing that vision. Throughout his long service from the Unification Wars to his final sacrifice, Malcador consistently demonstrated willingness to pay any personal cost for humanity's survival, and when necessary to impose terrible costs on others in service to that same goal. What distinguishes Malcador from many similarly pragmatic figures in imperial history, however, was his apparent absence of personal ambition. Throughout his millennia of service, from the shadows of the Unification Wars to the conflagration of the heresy, no credible historical evidence suggests he sought power for its own sake or glory for himself. His goal appears to have been singular and consistent, ensuring humanity's survival in a hostile universe, regardless of personal cost or recognition. In the final analysis, Malcador's greatest legacy may be the Imperium's continued existence itself. The institutions he created have identified and neutralized countless existential threats across the millennia. The administrative frameworks he established have maintained essential continuity. Despite the upheavals of successive ages, the strategic principles he implemented, defense in depth, institutional redundancy, contingency planning, had repeatedly proven crucial to the Imperium's resilience in crisis after crisis. If the Emperor is rightfully recognized as the father of the Imperium, then Malcador must be acknowledged as its architect, where the Emperor inspired through transcendent power. Malcador built through patient, methodical effort, where the Emperor commanded through charismatic authority. Malcador guided through institutional design and subtle influence. In the words of attributed to Constantine Valdor, in the aftermath of the siege, the Emperor's light illuminated the path, but it was Malcador who built the road upon which humanity would walk 10,000 years later. Though the road has weathered and cracked in places, humanity continues to walk this path. Still, this fact is perhaps the most fitting testament to the enduring legacy of Malcador, the hero. The last ember of daylight had long since faded from the sky when adept historian Vogel finally set down his quill. The conclusion of his writing, for today at least, was complete. His shoulders ached from hours bent over the manuscript, and the illuminator's glow seemed to have burned itself in two. His vision ghostly after images dancing before his tired eyes each time he blinked outside the viewport. Darkness had swallowed the cracked landscape of New Ithaca. The distant lights of Hab settlement Tertius were no longer visible, obscured by the intensified rain that now drummed against the outpost. With martial precision, only occasionally did a flash of distant lightning illuminate the primal vista, revealing for a heartbeat the silhouettes of the mountain range against a midnight sky devoid of stars. Vogel's weathered hands moved with practiced efficiency as he secured his day's work. He sprinkled fine sand across the fresh ink, then gently tipped the excess back into its container. The parchment pages were carefully stacked and slipped into a worn leather folio, which he then sealed with a small brass lock more symbolic than secure, but tradition demanded it. The folio was placed in a drawer beneath his desk itself, secured with a more substantial lock bearing the small skull, insignia of inquisitorial approval. The illuminator was adjusted to its lowest setting, casting the small chamber into half shadow. The familiar objects of his daily existence, the shelf-off, reference texts, the small shrine to the emperor in the corner, the ancient cogitator whose machine spirit required daily benedictions to function, all transformed into looming silhouettes, at once familiar and strange in the dimmed light. His cup, Ophrasaph, had grown cold hours ago. A thin film forming on its surface, Vogel carried it to the small wash basin in the corner, where the plumbing groaned and shuddered as he rinsed it clean, the water always with that faint metallic taste, peculiar to. Nether splashed over his fingers, cool and clarifying. He CD his hands and brought the water to his face, washing away the accumulated weariness of the day's intellectual labours in the small reflective surface above the basin. A stranger's face looked back at him, lined and spotted with age-white hair thin to wisps, eyes sunken, but still bright with the inner fire of purpose. Vogel barely recognized himself sometimes. This ancient server of knowledge, who had once been a young man filled with the zeal of discovery. The chronometer chimed softly, marking the midnight hour, somewhere deep in the outposts. Infrastructure systems recalibrated with faint mechanical sighs, and the distant gurgle of recyclers processing the day's waste. The building seemed to settle around him like an old beast finding comfort before sleep. Vogel moved to the small alcove that served as his sleeping quarters, separated from his work area by a faded curtain of imperial grey. The narrow cot, with its thin mattress, had once seemed an aesthetics punishment. Now it beckoned with the promise of relief for his aching bones. He changed methodically into his sleep garments, folding his historian's robes with precise movements and placing them in the small storage compartment beneath his bed. From a chain around his neck, he removed a small silver pendant, an aquila, clasping a book in its talons, the symbol of the Adeptus Administratum division, to which the Lexicanum Imperialis belonged. This he placed carefully upon the small table beside his bed, next to the Holic image of a woman whose name he had not spoken aloud in 3 decades. His evening preparations were completed with the application of sacred unguent to his temples and the whispered recitation of the Litany of Daily Accounting, 97 words acknowledging the God Emperor's omniscience and the historian's duty to record truth as it served. Humanity Ash lowered himself onto the cot, his joints protesting with small pops, and Creeks Vogel's eyes fell upon the manuscript box containing tomorrow's research materials. The label, written in a hand, not his own, read: Ms. Protocols, Terror, Mobilization Orders, Prague. Another piece of the puzzle. He had dedicated his life to assembling another day's journey. Into the mind of the Emperor's most trusted servant, the Rhine continued its steady Persion. Against the outpost walls, a natural rhythm that had accompanied countless nights of sleep. Distantly, thunder rolled across the peaks, a sound both threatening and comforting in its reminder that for all humanity, striving the natural world continued in majestic indifference. What dreams did you have? Malcador Vogel thought to himself in the darkness as he pulled the regulation blanket over his thin shoulders. Did you foresee what your Imperial would become? Did you know the cost of your legacy? The questions would remain unanswered as they had for 10 millennia. The old historian's eyes grew heavy, the weight of years and knowledge pressing upon him in that liminal space between wakefulness and slumber. Vogel sometimes imagined he could feel the presence of those who had come before him, the countless scholars who had dedicated their lives to preserving fragments of truth in an age of myth. He wondered not for the first time if someday another aged historian would sit at another desk on another world piecing together fragments of Thaddeus Vogel's existence from surviving records. The thought brought a small smile to his lips as consciousness began to fade and then silence. But for the rain and the soft breathing of an old man dreaming of ancient heroes and forgotten truths, while around him the great machinery of the Imperium ground onward through the night, as it had for 10,000 years since Malcador the hero had turned to ash upon the golden throne.